This
we
conference
looked at
will
a
now
couple of
be
things
recorded.
in regards to equal opportunities, and obviously the last learning outcome that we did, which was looking at going into a bit of detail with regards to the origins of word prejudice, stereotyping, and oppression, and they were a part and parcel of when we talk about discrimination. So discrimination can be meted out in three different ways, and they generally are seen in the form of either oppression. That means you're basically looking at forcing an individual to do something which is against their will, or they're not happy to do that. In the other bit, we looked at prejudice. Prejudice was primarily looking into we being biased about or being judgmental about individuals that we deal with, and this was primarily because of our values and beliefs. And when we talk about stereotyping, we basically look at behavior. And in behavior, what we look at is we basically, depending on what experiences we've had in the past, on the basis of behavior, we are able to look at drawing conclusions or putting people into a category, and that would be termed as stereotyping. That means you're from such and such culture, or this culture depicts this and this, or this kind of a attribute, or bits in terms of how we would look at making or forming a judgment. And in those cases they would be essentially looking at stereotyping. Now, when we also looked at some of the details in terms of examples, in terms of what does stereotyping, for example, mean in the UK. So, for example, if we claim that you are this type of person and you could be wrong, or the idea that you're proposing because you come from this particular background, or have this particular belief, would be wrong, and this particular bit is generally conforming to what is called stereotyping. Now, there are lots of different types of stereotyping as well, and this is something that we looked at when we talked about in detail. And what I'd referred mostly and suggested to most of you was to look at doing a bit of reading, on stereotyping, on prejudice, and obviously oppression by looking at Wikipedia, because obviously in that there are details of these three different terms given, which explain things like explicit stereotypes, implicit stereotypes, and why we look at discussing this, and why we have related this to discrimination in particular. Now, with that understanding in mind, what we are going to do is obviously go into the third learning outcome today. And the third learning outcome today is focused on understanding issues relevant to equal opportunity and diversity. So here we have three assessment criteria. They're going to be relating to exploring the origins and principles of how equal opportunity came about, why it was felt that we need to have something as an act or as a legislation to basically make this a law, in terms of ensuring that people and are given equal treatment irrespective of their culture, background, or where they come from, or what values and beliefs they have. The second would be to look at defining diversity. Now, Britain is a diverse nation, so obviously we thrive on diversity, and obviously it's a nation of immigrants or migrants. And over the years, what has happened is that when we in general talk about diversity, we will basically look at the meaning of the word diversity, which is basically people being different. We have variety of or different or variety. Another word would be variety. And what we are going to do is talk about this in the context of diversity in terms of how did it originate, and what does it mean when we talk that we are a country of diverse people, diverse cultures, and multiculturalism in general. And this is where we will also slightly relate it to the fact that we've discussed what is called inclusion. That was in the first learning outcome. So another term that we came across when we talk about diversity, which is variety, which is something that we talk about in general within the UK. We will also look at basically the concept of inclusion. Last assessment criteria is going to be focused on providing examples of positive and negative practice when we talk about equal opportunity or discrimination. And in this case, we will specifically focus on the legislations which have been introduced over the years, and those legislations, how do they help in preventing any sort of discrimination which can be meted out to individuals in different situations, whether it's a job interview, whether it's at work, whether it's primarily, you know, in relation to, say, for example, your place of worship or any other place wherein you feel that this treatment, or the behavior which has been meted out to you essentially conforms to what is called being discriminatory. Now, we will look at discussing some part of this learning outcome with the presentation, and what I'm going to do is share that with you now, so that we are able to discuss each of these assessment criteria in a bit more detail. Now, in general, when I want to talk about learning outcome 3 and look at basically issues around or issues which are relevant to equal opportunity and diversity, what we need to be able to do is talk about this in the context of health and social care, because obviously it's a very detailed topic. But what we want to look at is how do we talk about equality and diversity, primarily in the case of looking at health and social care sector. So in simple terms, if I would put it, equality in health and social care means that we provide similar or same access to all healthcare services, irrespective of taking into account any considerations from where the people come from, what their belief or background is. So this would mean that we do not take into account age, gender, ethnicity, their background, their lifestyle, sexual orientation. We don't look into in terms of previous backgrounds. Obviously, you will look at it from a point of view of previous medical history, but the idea here is to not to say that, okay, I can't treat you, or this treatment cannot be given out because you have a prior condition. No, that will not be taken into account. Disability is not taken into account, and any sort of religion or belief that you have is not taken into account while looking at, obviously ensuring that these care, when I say care and healthcare services, are provided primarily to individuals within the UK and within the health and social care system. So when we use any of these terms as a pretext to differentiate, that would clearly mean that we are discriminating. So if I say that, say for example, if you were running a private practice or you were running a private care home, and there was, say for example, an individual seeking to take admission and obviously become a resident of the care home, but they had underlying conditions, then if you are refusing the patient, or the resident, in terms of not taking them on the basis of, for example, they having certain types of illness, then in those cases that would be seen as discrimination. Yes, if there are certain requirements of that patient, which means that a specific type of care has to be provided, equipment has to be made available, and obviously the care home needs to have certain bare minimum requirements of treating or taking care of that patient, and if they are not there, then the refusal is done on the basis of that we do not cater to such patients. That is fine. But in general, if you have patients with similar conditions in the care home, and then you refuse somebody who's probably over the age of 90, and you envisage that there would be more precaution and more care required to be done, which might not be beneficial, and you refuse it on those grounds, because of making their illness a pretext, then that would be termed as discrimination. Another example of this would be that if, for example, your care home advertises as a which provides care, just taking to the example of care home, and it advertises that we provide 5-star accommodation facilities for residents, which include sauna, pool, gym, things like that, and that has a certain amount of fees. Now in those cases, if you are the only care home in that area, and then say for example, if there are residents which approach that we would want to take up residency in the care home for the purposes of care being provided, if they are refused on the basis of their social background, which is in terms of non-affordability, then that would be termed as again discrimination. So there are policies and procedures in place wherein, if you are coming from a slightly say low economic background, or for example, if there is a certain amount of structure in terms of what has to be paid to the care home in terms of getting admission and care, that in those cases sometimes the local authorities and councils will prop up the budget, so the individual will pay some part of it and some part of it will come from the local council, but that would mean that there is no discrimination or no general refusal done on admission on the basis of your social income or your background in terms of social strata within the society. So when we talk about in general equality in health and social care, we'd be looking at making sure that care is provided irrespective of these factors taken into account, and that would be termed as equality as far as this is concerned. Now, one of the other things that we also would want to look at is talk about the let's say the origins of diversity, and why do we look at diversity. So when we talk about equality, when we talk about diversity, there's another word or term that we included in the first discussion, is inclusion. And inclusion in workplace is important because when we give out or provide these services, it is important because this if we are not discriminating, if we are not treating people with the same intent, then in some cases what we are looking at is also ensuring that there is tolerance and inclusion within, say for example, the setup, and that setup and include tolerance would essentially mean that people are accepted. They are accepted with whatever backgrounds or culture belief they come from. So inclusion would be a state of in being included. That means you are going to include people into existing groups and structures, and that would mean that you are going to be providing equal opportunities and servicing the requirements of the patients by ensuring that adequate resources are put in place. And that would mean resources which could be physical, administrative, financial, infrastructural, to ensure that they do not feel excluded. They feel that they are wanted, and they feel that they are cared for, and they are essentially included in all groups or all activities within a particular care home or within a particular setting. So sometimes you say that when we look at classifications of, say, BAME, Black, Asian, Minority Community. A lot of companies and organizations now have created, I wouldn't use the word quotas, but obviously have ensured that legislation has ensured from the government that there is equal representation of from all groups within the society, in all stratas of life, in all public sector, and obviously in private sector workings or places of work. And that has been done primarily through the process of what is called inclusion. So when we talk about diversity and when we talk about discrimination and equality, we will also generally be asked about or will refer to what is called inclusion. Now, when we in general talk about the concept of diversity, and we talk about in general diversity, in health and social care, we would also be looking at, the aspects of how we approach, patients. How do we provide care in terms of, delivering it? Because you could be one of the practitioners delivering the care. There could be other people involved in the team, and that would be, looking at providing this care. So when we look at this concept of diversity, we will also again depend on, when we talk about diversity, which we will look at from a point of view of differences between people, that should be appreciated, and people's beliefs, cultures, and values should be treated with respect. And that is what the purpose of diversity, or the definition of diversity will be in the case of health and social care sector. So that means we are going to be looking at appreciating people from where they come from, their beliefs, their values, and culture, and we are going to be treating them with equality and also with respect. And that essentially would turn out to be what is the concept of diversity in healthcare. Now, on a broader term, if I go into a bit more detail and we look at, why this is the case, we would be looking at the the concept of diversity, which will often include inclusion of healthcare professionals, trainers, educators, researchers, patients, which are coming from varied background or culture and belief or various socio-economic status, irrespective of where they come from in terms of what language they speak or essentially what region they come from, but they will all be given similar care when it comes to looking at equality in terms of you won't be able to differentiate. So in the UK, the health system is is basically the health care, mental health care, any sort of care is primarily provided by the government, and that is given out or basically reaches to the members of public through the National Health Service and the structure of National Health Service. Now there is no differentiation between who's rich and poor, what kind of access you get. If you're on the waiting list, you're on the waiting list just like other patients, but there is no differentiation or no way that you can either jump that list or be given preference. But in that would be followed through the code, which is code of practice, which has been laid down, and all members of public within the UK would get the same amount or same type of service, which is primarily given as per the terms and conditions or as per the code of practice defined in the NHS constitution, in terms of the NHS Act of 2010. Now, when we would look at why this is important, because we, as a diverse nation, wherein the healthcare is subsidized and obviously provided by the government, here the diversity in health ensures that individuals from all backgrounds, beliefs, ethnicities, and their beliefs and culture would get the same amount of or same type of care, irrespective of all these factors that we are discussing in terms of background, belief, ethnicity, perspectives from in terms of social economic status. They will all be given the same kind of care when they come in to receive care as a patient within the National Health Service. Now, when we in look at, say, for example, when we look at obviously the concept in general about the diversity in health and social care, we are also going to be looking into understanding how this as a journey in terms of diversity has come about. Why this is now is widely accepted, and as an organization or as a let's say a setting or as a carer or as a person working within a health and social care setting, why we need to be aware of this, what are the typical definitions of equality, diversity, inclusion, and why and what does it mean. So when we look at conforming to certain policies and procedures within an organization, you would be looking at conforming with following the equality policy, the discrimination policy or the Act of 2010, Equality Act of 2010. You would be looking at some of the policies which have been formed by the organization, but on the basis of legislation which has been introduced by the government over the years. So when we look at the Health and Safety Act of 1975 and then a revision of that act in 2015, we look at Data Protection Act, which was introduced in 1998, then a revision of that with GDPR in 2016. You look at the Health and Safety Act, you look at the Equality Act, you look at the Discriminatory Act. These are all acts which have been put in place, and over a point in time, they undergo revision from the government because of the changing times and requirements in terms of how the act, which is now a law, needs to be interpreted in modern situations when it is being applied. So that is where you will also see that some of these acts and legislations will typically undergo changes, and those changes would be essentially required because of the changes happening in terms of how they are to be interpreted and how they are related to a particular sector when the services are being provided. So if we get into, say, for example, with this understanding into some of the assessment criteria and look at what are the origins and principles of equal opportunity, the equal opportunity will also be defined as equality. And obviously, from a theoretical perspective, when we talk about equality, it basically brings out a general idea that people ought to compete on equal terms or level playing field, as we normally say. So they should not be disadvantaged if they come from a different background, culture, or ethnicity. They should all be able to get a level playing field. So, for example, a simple example that I would put here would be that when athletes train and they get shortlisted into participating in the Olympics from a particular country, then in this case, they are all athletes are given, say, for example, equal opportunities to prove meet the requirements which have been set. And if they are able to meet the requirements, then obviously they are shortlisted to represent and participate in the Olympics representing their country. Now, here there is no discrimination or any sort of let's say treatment given to any particular person who comes from maybe a fairly say, for example, from a different socio-economic background. No preference is given whether you're male or female. If you're good in that category and you meet that criteria which has been set by the national standards, in order for you to qualify, you would be given an opportunity to represent and obviously participate in the Olympics. And then the level playing field is provided, which means yes, you would have access to facilities wherein you train, wherein you get coaching. But in certain cases, obviously, these access to playing facilities, for example, when we look at people who participate or represent Britain, for example, in bicycling, or in some sort of equipments or stadia which is required for preparation, then the government has created infrastructure which is accessible to all people, and they are able to train using that particular infrastructure, and then obviously qualify, or when they meet the requirements, they're able to qualify to represent the country in Olympics. So similarly, when we talk about just from a concept of equal opportunity or equality, here we are going to be looking at that under the umbrella of diversity, people from all walks of life will get the same access to health and social care as it is written in the NHS constitution, and there'll be no differentiation which will be done on the basis of their background, race, ethnicity, or the socio-economic background they come from. So this is where we would say that this particular aspect of equality is generally applied when we talk about in the in the context of health and social care. Now, there are certain sectors you might think and you might ask that, okay, are there any sectors in which obviously there could be a difference in terms of how equality and diversity could be applied? Yes, there could be certain sectors wherein the government is not subsidizing or providing these services, or the private sector is setting in, and that is where you would see that obviously equality and diversity is implemented as a standard policy and procedure when these services are being provided. But there could be differentiation on the basis of where you come from and how you come from, or what is your socio-economic status. A simple example that you can relate here is that if you have private medical insurance, now if you have private medical insurance, then in those cases, people are paying an additional premium to receive, services should they need in the case of, say, for example, healthcare, and because they are using private, they have private medical insurance. That means they can also go across, apart from the NHS, they can go across to private providers like Bupa or Spiral hospitals, and they could get treatment done from there. Now, that will be obviously possible because of your socioeconomic status, or maybe private medical insurance being given by your employer. But generally speaking, that would mean that in some cases you would not be able to apply equality as a concept, because in those cases it is going to be driven and dependent on the socioeconomic status of the person. That means they are coming from an income or a background wherein they are able to afford it, and that affordability allows them to access private medical health or private healthcare. Now, if you compare this with the US, you would generally see that within the US, obviously there is nothing like the National Health Service. Everybody has to have national what do you call, private medical insurance. And if you have private medical insurance, the Obama bill, which was introduced, and it is now kind of known as the Obama bill, he introduced a legislation that when you have to access when you have to access medical services or healthcare services, everybody should have medical insurance. But if there are premiums which have to be given, or have to be say, for example, If you have a condition like, say, for example, you have a heart condition or a diabetic condition, then in your case, your private medical insurance is going to be more expensive in terms of your premium that you pay. So what he introduced was one bill which allows all people in the US, which are US nationals, to have private medical insurance. They will need to have it. They will pay premiums according to what they can afford, but if they need treatment, in certain cases wherein those treatments would require them to prop up their premiums to be able to receive that, then the government would step in and bridge that gap by providing that premium when that treatment is needed. But generally, everybody should have medical insurance, and that medical insurance should allow individuals to access health and social care services, within the US. But in some cases, if you say, for example, you've had an accident and you need to have now, your private medical insurance covers it to a certain amount, say, for example. But after that, if you still need support and obviously treatment, then in those cases, the government steps in and obviously bridges that gap in the premium, and that allows you to access, healthcare and healthcare services in the US. So a very different system, but there also what he has introduced along, because of the Obama bill, is that he's introduced equality in terms of people being, or US citizens being able to access healthcare irrespective of their socioeconomic background and their income or their status. And that has been a significant change which was introduced in 2008 in the US. Otherwise, people who did not have the affordability or the means to be able to get treatment, could not get it. And obviously, in those cases, they could have been, there were fatalities, and obviously that created an inequality in their healthcare system. So this bit of introducing that premiums will be bridged, or premiums will be compensated or topped up, as I would put it, by the government in certain cases when people cannot afford the treatment, is the signature Obama bill that he introduced in his presidency. But fortunately for us in the UK, obviously the health and social care services are provided through the NHS. They are all, obviously under the purview of the government, and that means irrespective of our background, religion, caste, culture, where we come from, or whether we have, social economic status, that has got nothing to do, because the government provides the national health, the services within the health and social care sector. They are provided through the National Health Service, and they are provided, or people have access to it in the same, all people have access to it without any, discrimination, or without any factors being brought in for the purposes of, comparison. Now, what we will also look at is understand, say, for example, when I talk about equality in general, what we would want to do is understand, what is this provision. So when we talk about equality in terms of health and social care provision, a lot of us know that when we look at medication, or for example, if we need medical treatment, if you're a child, or if you have children who are under the age of 16, there is no prescription fees also required to be paid. Or if you're over the age of 60, then you don't need to pay any prescription fees. Now these are standards, or rules and regulations which the government has introduced. They might slightly vary across the four nations: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But generally speaking, in Scotland, there are no prescription fees because the population is about 5.5 million. But when we look at England and Wales, there is a certain amount of prescription fees that you need to pay to be able to access medicine. But if you're under the age of 16 or over the age of 60 or 65, then in those cases, you would generally see that you do not even pay any sort of prescription fees when you get a prescription from your GP. Now, this is implementation of equality because of legislation which has been passed by the government, or the act or legislation which has been introduced by the government. So when you are pregnant, or for example, in certain cases, when you have certain conditions, then also you're not required to pay, for example, prescription fees. If you are on benefits, or you are under the, say, for example, the universal credit system, in some cases, there are categories. If you have ever seen on your prescription, when you turn it around, when you take it to the pharmacy, normally the pharmacist or the one of the persons in the pharmacy would ask you to sign the prescription. And in some cases, if you're not looking at paying the prescription fees, that you're working in the army, you're a person who's serving in the army or armed forces, if you're pregnant, if you're a student, or if you are, for example, under the age of 16, you are over the age of 65, and there are one or two other categories in terms of if you're on benefits or receiving job seekers allowance, then you are not required to pay the subscription fees, which is required to get medication. So this is a simple example of how provision of health and healthcare services is done in the UK, and this is predominantly possible because of the equality legislation and the rules which have been introduced by the government as far as UK is concerned. Now, when we also talk about how do we promote as a workplace, what we also need to know is how do we promote the equality and diversity policy at a workplace. Now, what you will generally see is that most organizations need to have an equality and diversity policy. Now, in our case, as a educational institution, I don't know how many of you have gone into the website and obviously seen, we are also required, as an institution, to have what is called an equality and diversity policy. So let me just quickly show that to you. And this is true for all workplaces or all types of workplaces. So if I go down, you would generally see that we have an equality and diversity policy which is given here. There are certain minimum requirements, um, which basically would essentially require you to have an let's say publicly advertise and make available and implement some of these policies in the workplace. So things like, when we talk about data protection, health and safety, we talk about equality and diversity policy, in terms of reasonable adjustments and special considerations. These are basic policies that have to be put into place because we are trying to implement equality and diversity policy in a workplace. Now, in certain cases, for example, we are in a premises wherein it has access to wheelchair or it has lifts. So in those cases, if we have learners who come in and obviously have had, say for example, if you've had, assuming if somebody does have an accident and is wheelchair ridden or needs crutches to walk, or normally reach and come into a college, then obviously certain provisions have to be made. And in those cases, you look at special adjustments or reasonable adjustments which can be made so that people are able to adjust for the time frame in which they are undergoing treatment or recovering from a particular accident. So these are basic bits that have to be included for the purposes of ensuring that there is no discrimination and there is no undue advantage being taken by the organization. And publishing of these policies and procedures ensures that the organization is essentially complying with the legislation which has been put in place by the government. Now, this is an example that I'm showing you, that obviously when we talk about the Equality Act, we talk about the discrimination, what are the various bits which are covered in the policy and how they are implemented within an organization, is something which is clearly given in this particular document. And most employers or places of work would need to have these available, prominently displayed, or have them available either on their website or in printed or electronic form, so that people can have access to it. Now, if you feel that you are not being, you feel you're not being treated equally or fairly, then in these cases, people have the ability to be able to use these policy documents to look at making a complaint or lodging a complaint, and it explains what kind of, incidences can be treated as, discrimination, or as can be treated as that they have not been given a fair chance, or obviously have, the treatment meted out has not been fair. And in those cases, you can also go in and appeal, against how, and why this why is that you feel that this has not been done, and you can appeal for it, and the organization is then required by law to undertake an inquiry, and in those inquiry the findings of that inquiry puts things across in black and white. So as you can see, it's quite a detailed policy which covers a lot of aspects of things which are related to equality and diversity. So it could be in training and development, it could be in recruitment, it could be in the environment, it could be in the support services which the college provides. Like for example, if I say, if there is preferential treatment given to a particular student, but the others are not getting that treatment, which could be termed as unfair support services. It could be grading, for example, in the assignments. You might be a favorite of the teacher and might get good grades, but somebody else who has put in the equal or same amount of work but has not been given the same grading could represent, and that would be a part and parcel of equality, but start under the academic policy or misconduct. You would be looking at recruitment and selection, and that would be covered under that aspect. And when we look at participation and obviously access to facilities within a particular workplace, they would also be covered under the aspect of equality policy. So a lot of when we talk in general about equality, you would be looking at a lot of things are essentially taken into account to ensure that there is no discrimination, difference in terms of treatment meted out to individuals, which will essentially be giving them or affecting them in terms of the services that they are receiving from a particular workplace. And this context in terms of health and social care would be again related to, in general, the care being provided to an individual or a patient, and there is where this particular policy is going to be looked at. So for example, if sometimes you see, I don't know, and this is something which some of you might be able to relate to, is that sometimes you see that if you had an accident, and you've undergone treatment, and after that, when you undergone treatment, what tends to happen is that if you need a support of a crutch or a wheelchair, normally the national health service will provide that to you. And on the wheelchair, on the crutch, it is normally written as a property of the NHS, and when not being used, should be returned back to the hospital. Now, the reason is because there are some of these resources which the hospital has got funding for and have developed it and have it depending on the number of patients they receive and provide these services. Sometimes some of these resources need to be after you've gotten better, or you've come out of that particular situation and you've been able to use those services. Sometimes it is recommended that these instruments, equipments are then returned back, because they then can be put to use after a bit of maybe wear and tear and refurbishment for the use and needs of other patients within the hospital, because some of them might not be able to afford it. So in this case, it is a part of the treatment plan wherein the NHS would provide this to you, and then some of them, once they get better, and obviously if you don't need that in the future, then it is expected that these are to be returned back, so that it can be put to good use. That means it can be provided to other patients who might need it after or during the course of their recovery. And this is where you get to see in smaller aspects of how the National Health Service or the NHS would essentially be looking at ensuring that equalities, and the care type of service and the care being provided is being done from a perspective of equal opportunity being given to all the patients. So any questions on this so far? Okay. Now, when we look at the concept of diversity, here we would need to understand why this came about and what does it mean. So again, going back to one or two things that we talk about in terms of diversity. Diversity for us means that we are recognizing and taking into account everything that makes us unique as an individual. Now, we also would look at diversity. When we talk about this in general, we would also look at that in the UK there is a diversity law which is an act which has been put into which is something which most organizations need to have and implement, and this is required by law. So that means inclusion and diversity is something which all organizations would need to have and promote, and this is protected by law. Now, when we look at different backgrounds, the way we live, the say for example, the personalities we have, or the I would put it this way, for example, the way we think in some cases, and we come, and obviously have opinions and come from a variety of backgrounds, and we have, because of which we have different perspectives. So your lifestyle, your social economic status, your culture, your belief would give you certain perspectives which could be different from other individuals. And when we talk about taking into account all these perspectives, all the aspects of how an individual is different, one is different from the other, and we take them into account from a positive aspect of it, and treat it as equal across when we are discussing, or when we are taking into account this for a particular situation, would be the concept of diversity and how we apply diversity as far as general within the society is concerned. So this concept of diversity allows us to look at things from different angle, but at the same time it allows us to make an impact, because every individual is different, and when they deal, when they discuss, when they do their roles and responsibilities, they are going to have a different kind of an impact in terms of what they are doing in various communities, or in terms of various organizations, and this being taken into account to ensure that no discrimination is being vetted out, would be essentially the concept of diversity. Now, there is a, say for example, a particular let's say handout which I have got, and this particular handout is a handout which I want to show you. Is a handout which primarily looks at um, equality, diversity, and inclusion in a workplace. Now, this is uh, probably a 10-15 minute read, but this will give you, let me show you the handout, but this would give you, essentially a good idea in terms of how we are going to be looking at, dealing with this particular topic, because it's a vast topic. So when we look at this particular handout that I've shown you on the screen, what you're going to see is generally it talks about equality, diversity, and inclusion in a workplace, and it gives you some background in terms of how this is important and how they've come into play. So when we look at this particular handout, because we need to look at diving into the concept of diversity and where are the origins of this, is something that you get to see being talked about in terms of historical context. So obviously this term of being equal, or the state of being equal, was first used in the early 15th century, and over a point in time the idea of how people need to be treated equal as equals has matured over the centuries, and obviously it takes into account their personality, race, religion, ethnicity, gender, disability, beliefs, values, cultures. But it still allows, by taking into all these accounts, still allows us to embrace and celebrate in a way within the UK the aspect of that we are a diverse society, and we are a society which is tolerant to diversity. Now, in accordance with this, when we talk about legislation, there is an Equalities Act of 2010 which was introduced, and obviously this is a revision which was done to the earlier Act of 2005 in 1990. What you generally see is that government has made it a law, or put this into a law, that we need to be able to treat people from different backgrounds, culture, race, nationality, whatever it is, with equal rights. And this law basically puts this act particularly puts that into law. So equal opportunities are provided to all individuals. So when we look at schools, for example, in the UK, education is free. Whether you go, come from an X background, Y background, schooling, irrespective of that, is absolutely free. Yes, to a certain extent, there are lots of debates which happen that why are grammar schools, allowed to gain or get funding from the government. Obviously, in those cases, there is a slight bit of differentiation which happens on the basis of socioeconomic status. So people who are able to afford can also go into grammar schools, but the local councils also, and there is a testing system. So you can qualify to go to a grammar school, and in some cases, if you're not able to meet the requirements of the fees and other, say for example, the fees requirements because of the income and background you come from, the local authority will prop that up, and there is no differentiation allowed, on that side, or discrimination allowed on that side. So every year you would see in certain years like grade 6 or grade 7 or in grade 3, you would generally see students will appear for exams to be able to, and those exams are not conducted by schools. If you look at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, these exams are conducted by the GMCA for all the grammar schools in the Manchester area. And obviously, if you classify, a listing is put out, and that listing allows you to then understand that, okay, where have you got admission, or on the basis of test, what marks you have scored, you're then able to get admission in that particular grammar school. So this particular handout, I would suggest, is what you need to go through. This particular handout will give you the details about the background of the concepts of diversity, inclusion, and equality, and is a good read because this will also give you some indication and background into the various acts which are related to the Equality Act of 2010, and directly or indirectly, things like anti-fraud policy, anti-bribery policy, discrimination policy that you get to see, safeguarding policy that you see, in different organizations, are all different forms of connotation of how diversity is applied, within a particular context of, a workplace. And this would also be useful for you to generally increase your knowledge about the three important terms which are referred to time and again in this unit, and they tend to be equality, diversity, and inclusion. So my suggestion would be, this particular handout is on Moodle, and I would suggest that you read this particular handout because this will give you this additional background into, to understand the theoretical bits about the concept of diversity and how it came about. There are some useful websites which also can be clicked on, from here, but generally speaking, there will be additional reading which might be in journal context but not in the context of health and social care. So the handout is a good handout from a concept of getting background into, I would say, the history of equality, diversity, and inclusion, but in a general context, and might not relate entirely to health and social care sector. Now, once you've read this, what I've done now in the few slides, in 2 slides, is I have contextualized this in the context of health and social care. So when we look at the concept of diversity, what we are looking at is exploring the different characteristics of how diversity is applied within the society. And when we look at diversity within the society, we will look at certain aspects of quantifying it by talking about interests, beliefs, age, lifestyle, personal characteristics, and cultural identities. And this is where I've put in an example to classify it to the context of health and social care, and how, as a practitioner, we would essentially be applying the concept of diversity when we provide services to various patients while working within the sector. So if we look at, for example, one of the things like beliefs. Now here, sometimes you would see certain people have physical symbols of belief. For example, in the case of Christians, we have the cross. In the case of Muslims, for example, they would be looking at so for example, we look at churches, we look at mosques, we look at synagogues, we look at temples, we look at gurdwaras. So obviously these are all beliefs wherein they are to be included in terms of society. So you can't restrict that, you can't build the mosque, or you can't build another church, or build a temple. So in this case, the concept of diversity, because there are people coming and living in the UK from diverse backgrounds, they are free to practice their beliefs and their cultures, and accordingly practice them or worship them. Then in those cases, those beliefs are taken into account, and different places would of worship are allowed to be made or constructed, and that is where you would look at in some cases, diversity being applied. Now, if I look at this in the context of health and social care, sometimes you would see ministers of religion are allowed to visit patients who are receiving, say, end of life care or are receiving critical care or may not survive. You would generally see, attendance or in general, places of worship being created in various hospitals, in certain locations, even in Universal Square. We on the ground floor we have a place wherein most people who believe in Islam and have to do prayers 4 or 5 times a day can actually go in and obviously use that room, which is called the prayer room. So, in health and social care, when we look at ministers of religion getting access to patients during certain conditions like end of care, which is being provided, or if they have a wish, or if they want to look at obviously seeing somebody, then in those cases you would take into account their beliefs and necessary let's say steps would be taken to ensure that that wish or that need can be fulfilled. Another example that I would give you is when we look at lifestyles. So, for example, sometimes you would see people wear a headscarf. So, in certain religions, if it is considered a part of their identity, sometimes when you're dealing with them as carers or as practitioners, what you would generally do is if you need to get access, or for example, in some cases, you need that to be removed or, taken out for the purposes of, say, providing medication or providing care, then obviously with the cultural beliefs and requirements, tolerances in mind, what we ask them politely to do is, can I touch this, or can I ask you to remove it? And that is where you're looking at being treating that person with respect, understanding their culture and requirements, and then obviously adequately requesting them to either give access or provide access or remove, so that you're able to provide the due care which is required to be delivered. And that would be taking into account some of the cultural identities or personal characteristics of the individual. And this is where we see that diversity is used, or training is done with the staff within the health and social care setting on a regular basis, for them to be able to understand and accept some of these diversities, so that care then can be meted out or given out, meeting those requirements of the patients. So respect, individuality, and obviously independence is allowed to be practiced, and information relating to this is provided through staff trainings, and that allows people working within this sector, which is practitioners, nurses, carers, healthcare assistants, doctors, medics, to be able to practice the concept of diversity when they are giving out, or when they are doling essentially, I would say, providing these services to the patients. Any questions on this? Okay. Last but not the least, the last assessment criteria talks about, we discussing the role of legislation in implementing and enforcing diversity within, UK, and in general within the health and social care sector. So we are not going to be focused on UK, but we are going to be focused on, the role of legislation primarily in promoting diversity within health and social care. Now, when we look at the impact of legislation, there are law acts and laws which are created, and they allow the government and government related bodies to use this authority to be able to ensure that diversity is taken into account while providing these services. Now, what are the positives of legislation? Positives of legislation or regulation is that it allows people to use it, and obviously it allows in this case diversity, equality, and inclusion to be enforced in all places wherein it needs to be done by using this legislation which has been introduced by the government. Now, to a certain extent, it also has been proven by research and studies that it also leads to what is called low staff turnover. That means if you have this legislation implemented within the organization, you would generally see people would be feeling safe and secure. that they would be treated equally. And then in those cases, what you generally see is that the staff or the people working within the organization tend to stay within the organization because they do not feel that they are being discriminated against, so they are not being given equal opportunities to prosper within their role. Now, there are lots of advantages in general about legislation, and that is why they've been put into place by the government, and that is where their role is to enforce the principles of equality and diversity in any sort of workplace. Now, there are some negatives of it as well. Now, negatives of it could be that if there is a fallout and if the employees or staff fall out with the employer, then obviously there are legal requirements which are required to be met. There is a link in the equality, diversity and inclusion handout, which I've just shown you earlier, and it talks about the ACAS forum. If you feel that this particular, if you feel that an employer is not being fair towards you, then you could take the employer into a tribunal, and that, in terms of the dealing of those services, primarily, happens through a body called ACAS, and ACAS is a government body which basically looks at, providing. Say services primarily to staff and employees working within the organization, to help them represent, in terms of if they feel that they have not been given proper treatment, or if they have been discriminated against when we are looking at they were working in a workplace. So ACAS essentially stands for Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. And those of you, if you have gone in and seen obviously the ACAS website, you would generally see that it basically talks. If I just quickly show you the website for a second, it will give a lot of detail about things which are related to. So if you just type ACAS on Google, you would generally see this comes in, and it would normally say, give advice, guidance and information on what is discrimination, what is bullying, what is harassment, in other forms, oppression, and how you can, if you feel that any of these is being meted out to you at your workplace, then how you can use the arbitration, advice, reconciliation, and the arbitration service to basically bring a case across your, across your employer. Now, that is where it meant that the negatives of legislation in this case could be that it could lead to legal cost and ramblings, and this could lead to useful hours being wasted when legal action is initiated. And in those cases, it is important for employers to ensure that these policies are put into practice. They are not just on paper, and they are being implemented to the core in terms of every word of it, so that one, they are complying with law, and the other bit is that they are trying to reduce any sort of legal action that can be brought against them because of the discrimination, or in this case, equal opportunities not being provided to the staff. Now, the role of legislation is what we need to understand. Now, there are these 5 different acts that we need to be aware of from a health and social care perspective. Obviously, there are lots of them, but generally speaking, these are the ones that we need to be aware of. And that is where I would suggest that when we talk about the role of legislation, these particular acts in general would inform you that how they are, say for example, why they were created, and obviously how they are enacted within an organization. Now, because this task talks about the role of legislation, what I would want you to do is basically use these acts and then do a bit of research at your end to find out, what these acts are and how and what they prescribe in terms of, looking at equality and providing equal opportunity. So here, my suggestion would be, for example, I would want you to go in and do a bit of research, although there is a handout which I will provide, which has all these acts as a Word document, which is going to be on Moodle, because I have that document. But what I would want you to do is go in and do a bit of quick search, like I'm going to show you now, and that would basically help you research and gather knowledge in terms of what the acts essentially mean and how they are related to equality, diversity, and equal opportunity in regards to this particular unit. So what I've done is I've just put on Google the Equality Act of 2010, and as you can see, it brings across a couple of things. But what we are going to do is look at this from a point of view of in the context of health and social care. So if I just put, and you go to Sky's website, and when you go to Sky's website, what you will be able to see is it talks about the Equality Act in the context of health and social care. And that is what you would need to read. So in this case itself, it'll talk about age discrimination, how this act is put into place, what are the legal mechanisms. And again, this would provide you the this particular site. If I just put it on, I shouldn't have shown it to you, but if I put it on the slide, would basically cover all the acts that we would want to understand from a perspective of how they are relevant to the health and social care sector. So you pretty much would be able to get every sort of information from here. This is what I would want you to read and understand and do a bit of research, so that you are aware that what is a Gender Recognition Act, what is an Equality Act, what is the Equality Act of 2010 when it was updated, what is the Human Rights Act, and how they are related to this particular unit of equality, diversity, or equal opportunity and diversity with regards to this particular unit. Now here the assignment when we discuss next week, or when we do it on Friday in the class, would be essentially to look at getting into details, because when it will ask you about this task and criteria, that what is the role of legislation, you will have to pick out one or two of these acts and talk about them by giving an example of how they are implemented within a health and social care setting. So that is where your research that you do now would be helpful for you to get into, and useful for you at a later stage when we do the discussion on assignment. So with this, we more or less have covered this particular unit, and all the assessment criteria in detail. You would have a copy of this presentation, and obviously, the recording which will be available, so that should you need to revisit what we've discussed today, can be done by going into one, reading the handout on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Second, looking at reading about the SKY's website, wherein it talks about the Equality Act in general related to health and social care. And the third would be to primarily focus on understanding the concept of diversity, which is primarily through the links on Wikipedia. Any questions on this so far?
Hi, morning, Rama.
Yes, good morning.
Sorry, you said we need to do the